colleague of mine, Amy Edmondson at Harvard University, once did a study of a myriad of hospitals in the Boston area. In particular, she studied the teams of nurses that existed on the different wards. So every hospital has labor and delivery, intensive care, et cetera. Those are staffed by nurses, and those teams are led by a charge nurse, the nurse in charge of the whole team. And what Amy and her research team did was they gave those nurses a variety of different surveys and metrics, and they asked essentially, evaluate the effectiveness of your team leader. And then they took those evaluations and they looked at all of the different performance metrics of the teams. And they found some really interesting stuff you would expect, like that the great leaders had higher performance ratings, had higher patient satisfaction ratings, had faster turnaround times, were more able to deal with unexpected incidents, et cetera. But they found one thing really, really interesting, counterintuitive, in fact. And even Amy worried that, like, wait a minute, I don't understand what's going on here. They found that the teams that had the highest rated leaders also had the highest rates of reported accidents on the ward. Now that's a little weird, right? Okay, so great leaders and great teams make more mistakes. What's going on here? It wasn't until they started doing qualitative research, going in and talking with each individual team, watching how they interacted, that they realized that when I say the great teams had a higher rate of reported accidents, that word reported is carrying an awful lot of weight. See, it turns out what was happening was that the great teams felt like they could actually admit the mistakes that they made, prescribing errors, administration errors, et cetera. And the poor teams felt like they had to hide those things, right? So the poor teams, in addition to being massively unethical, the poor teams were keeping mistakes from each other, not informing the rest of the team on what was going on. And really, if you think about it, not letting that team continue to learn from those mistakes. We'll come back to that thought in a moment. And when I ask most people, okay, when you look beneath the surface and you describe this idea, what's going on, most people give me the same answer. Most people say, oh, well, those teams had a bigger amount of trust on the team. Those teams had higher levels of trust. And that's true, but it doesn't totally define what's going on underneath the surface and the culture of that team. What Amy would say is that those teams, in addition to having trust, had a higher than average rate of what she would call psychological safety, of psychological safety on the team. This is a climate on a team that's marked by a sense of feeling safe to express yourself and to take risks. And an important caveat here, when I say risks, I don't mean like risky ethical behavior, I don't mean like going the wrong way by patients, et cetera. What I mean is interpersonal risks. And there's a lot of things that fall into that category of interpersonal risk. Admitting a mistake is a huge interpersonal risk. If you don't have a level of trust on the team to where you feel like you're going to have that held against you, you feel like you're going to be ridiculed for that, you're going to get a negative performance rating for that, et cetera, you're going to be less willing to take the risk of admitting a mistake. But when you look at several teams, you also find that things like speaking up because you disagree with the consensus, that's a huge interpersonal risk, right? You might be seen as someone who's rocking the boat. Even just expressing an out-of-the-box idea, hey, I know we've never tried this, but what if we did? That's an interpersonal risk. You're risking judgment by that. And so these teams of great leaders were more willing to take those risks. And it points to what I look at as sort of the cycle of psychological safety. Yes, trust matters. You build trust on a team so that people feel safe to take that risk. And then once they take that risk, we're not out of the woods yet because we have to look at how the team is going to respond to that risk. You share a crazy idea, are you going to be ridiculed? You disagree, are you going to be shot down and labeled as the negative person on the team? You admit a failure, are you going to have that held against you? What we need, and what Amy Edmondson saw, was that we need teams who will respond to people taking interpersonal risks with a sense of respect. Now, you've all been in this scenario, whether you realize it or not. You've probably been in a situation where you shared your brilliant idea. You think it's totally awesome, and then somebody says, we can't do that. We don't have the budget for that. We tried something like that a couple years ago. It didn't work. Right? Or you speak up to disagree, and all of a sudden the whole team just responds to you, shoots you down, and says, why do you have to be so negative and judgmental all the time? When you're in that situation where you, let's say, admit a failure, take that interpersonal risk of saying, here's how I messed up and what I learned, and people hold that over you, how much do you feel like you trust the team? You don't. And that's why it's more than just trust. It's this cycle of psychological safety. You build trust on a team so that people take the interpersonal risks that are then met with respectful behavior. You're heard, you're listened to, you're considered, you're valued. And what happens is trust grows. It's a virtuous cycle if done right, and a vicious cycle if done wrong.